Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So good morning, District 5030 Rotarians, and welcome to the end of week 3 in our festival training online pilot program to prepare Rotarians in our district for the coming Rotary year starting July 1st. This is the first of 2 sessions this Saturday morning. This session, COVID-19 impact on the fight against sex trafficking, will be presented by Virginia McKenzie from the Seattle 4 Rotary Club and Jeremy Valorin from Rescue Freedom International. My name is Henry Wong, and I will be the tech support for this session and helping to moderate questions. We'll start, as we've done in each session, with the vision of Rotary International. That is, together we see a world where people unite and take action to create lasting change across the globe, in our communities and in ourselves. And a couple housekeeping things before we get started. So in webinar mode, all participants are automatically muted. For those who are new to Zoom, we ask that you use the Q&A button on the bottom as questions come up during the presentation. You'll see the Q&A button on the control panel at the bottom of your screen. If you're calling on a phone or tablet, you may have to touch the bottom of your screen to bring up the control panel. At the end of the presentation, we'll welcome you to use your raise hand button, where we can then unmute you and allow you to ask your question live. The chat window can be used for sharing info and links, but we do ask you to use the Q&A box for any questions. And then also stay tuned at the very end, where we'll have some information on 2 new bonus sessions for this festival training, which will be on June 4th. So a little bonus material for you. But at this point, I'm happy to turn it over to Virginia McKenzie.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Virginia McKenzie, and I'd like to start by saying thank you to District Governor-elect Kathy Gibson for the opportunity to present, and all of the support that I have received from Jean Withers, our district trainer, and Henry Wong, and the other technicians who helped put on these presentations. Thank you. Our goals for this webinar is sex trafficking is a difficult topic. And we're going to learn some things about what is happening in the red light districts around the world. And you are going to love the ray of hope that you are going to hear amongst all of this. And I am hoping that you might feel inspired to join me on an international service project, a citizen diplomacy trip of sorts with Rescue Freedom. I hatched this idea just this week. It is very new. I have no idea where we would go or when it would be, but I have a feeling that it's going to be on the horizon. And if you are interested, I will let you know how to stay connected with me and get involved. So I like to start out with, everybody wants to know, why are you so passionate about this topic? And the best way I can describe it is back in 2014, there was a presentation at Seattle Rotary by Stolen Youth on the topic of sex trafficking. And I don't know how to say it any other way. I just saw red, and it made me so mad and so sad. And so I have spent the last 5 years meeting all of the players in Seattle and everywhere that I can who are fighting sex trafficking and figuring out what they need and how I can participate and how I can bring along the other Rotarians along with me. And I just want to say how meaningful it has been for me to work on a project that I feel so passionate about in the context of Rotary. So thank you to all of you who have joined me in small ways, in little ways, and I look forward to making new friends and having more positive impact on the topic. So our overview for today is we are going to get a presentation by Jeremy Valorant. He is president at Rescue Freedom International. And what I love about this is it is headquartered right here in Kirkland, Washington. I feel such a sense of pride about this. Jeremy was introduced to me by a fellow Seattle 4 Rotarian named Ben Wicks. And Jeremy has had some very sage wisdom for me from the very beginning and all the way through. I am so grateful to him that he agreed to join us today. And he's going to be sharing a very global perspective on the red light districts and how it's being affected by COVID-19. And then I'm going to transition to something very, very close to home, which is how can we protect our children from online predators? So I've got two really helpful slides and resources on that. And then we'll move to Q&A. So with that, I would like to turn things over to our keynote speaker, Jeremy Valorant.
Well, thank you so much, Virginia. Thanks for having me, everyone. So it was several years ago that Virginia and I met for lunch with this friend that she mentioned, Ben Wicks, another Rotarian. And I just have been so encouraged and inspired and impressed, Virginia, by your continued passion and enduring passion. You know, this is an issue that is intense enough that it often it draws a visceral response from people. And so it's one thing to react to an issue, and it's another thing to sort of join the fight. And I just have been so encouraged by the way that you've stuck with this literally for years, engaging your community, engaging your peers, engaging fellow Rotarians. So I'm just honored to be here. It's been fun to watch your journey and the Rotarians that have been impacted as a result. So as Virginia mentioned, I lead an organization called Rescue Freedom International. We're based right here in Kirkland, Washington. So my thought today is to give you just a quick snapshot of Rescue Freedom, how we got started, and what we're doing around the world and here in the United States as well. And then specific to how is COVID-19 affecting the fight against human trafficking. So I'll cover a fair bit of ground, but if you're relatively new to the issue of human trafficking, I won't leave you in the dust. We'll cover just a little bit of the basics just to give you a snapshot of the issue. And then I also recognize that that it is a Saturday on a holiday weekend. And so I want to thank you for joining us, and I'll try to keep it moving quick. But if you have any questions, I'll kind of keep an eye out too on the questions. So if you see me going like this, I'm looking at questions or comments, but we'll have some time for questions and comments as well afterwards. So if you have any burning questions or if there's ground I don't cover that you'd like to know, feel free to throw that in there, and we'll make it a lively discussion if we have the opportunity, or if you have any questions. So well, real quick, covering some ground. So I am a local boy through and through. My grandpa retired as Seattle PD. Spent after World War II, he came back, spent his first part of his career after the war as Seattle Fire, and then ended up moving over to Seattle PD and retired as a policeman in Seattle, and moved out to the thriving metropolis of Monroe, Washington, to build, his dream was to be a private flight instructor and to renovate or kind of repair small aircraft. So he opened the Monroe Airfield right across from the Evergreen Speedway, if you've ever been to the Evergreen State Fair. So I grew up on that property right there. My grandpa built that airport. So long roots here in the Pacific Northwest. But after high school, I left for about a decade and went to college and grad school out of the country, traveled the world, and got to work with the U.S. ambassador a little bit and kind of spread my wings, and then felt the draw of the Pacific Northwest back home. So I came back here thinking I would go down the track of the business world, and was working in the tech and startup space here in Seattle. But about 12 and a half years ago, I took a trip to India. A mentor of mine had spent part of his childhood there and was going to sort of retrace his childhood steps, and invited me to come along. And I now have 3 children, but this was before I was married, and I didn't have kids. So I could do things like spontaneously jump on a plane and say, sure, I'll go to India and travel around. But it wasn't a humanitarian trip. It was a tourist trip. I went because I love curry and naan bread and tandoori chicken. I wasn't going to do any kind of humanitarian service. It was just a trip for fun. But the last day of our trip, the last 36 hours, we were going back to Mumbai and flying back from Mumbai back to Seattle. And this mentor said, I have this friend that has been rescuing kids out of brothels in India. And I've always wanted to see the work. Are you okay if we spend our last 36 hours with him? And I'll never forget, even just when he threw that out there of, I have a friend that rescues kids from brothels. For me, again, growing up in Monroe, Washington, which at the time as a kid was a small town of 3,500. The suburban sprawl hadn't quite reached Monroe yet. And I remember thinking, wait, what? Kids in brothels? Like that wasn't even on my radar screen. And so we went, and that friend picked us up and drove us into one of the largest red light districts in the world. The red light district in Mumbai, they say at its peak was estimated to have about 50,000 women and children in sexual exploitation in 11 square blocks. So again, a small town kid trying to wrap his head around 50,000 people in sexual exploitation in 11 square blocks was just beyond comprehension. And as we drove through on a Friday night, and you could just see the thousands of women and children lining the streets, and a sea of taxis leaving to go to all the major hotel chains just packed full with young women, my blood just began to boil. And I was so discouraged, so angry, so frustrated, and just so confused of how does this happen in the world, and how did I not know, and what are the implications of this? And they drove us through, and then they dropped us off at the hotel and said, okay, tomorrow we'll see the other side of the story. And I remember thinking, I don't know if I want to see the other side of the story, honestly. But the next morning they picked us up and got out of bed, and I was still pretty discouraged and demoralized. And they started driving about 2 hours outside the city, and they said, okay, the first place we're going to stop is a home for children under the age of 12 who are HIV positive. And again, I remember thinking like, man, I don't know if I want to go like that. I don't know what I have to offer these kids. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to interact. Like, what do you do? And I was envisioning just a very depressing, kind of sterile, medicalized environment. And when we pulled up and walked in, these kids just full of joy and full of hope, like little kids came running and almost knocked me off my feet. And they wanted to sing and dance and play, the Indian version of patty cake and duck, duck, goose. And we were just running around. And I just remember thinking like, these are kids, like these are normal, happy, joyful kids who seem to be thriving. And it was like my heart just broke. And from there, we went to the home for teenage girls. And I remember thinking as we're driving, like, okay, this is probably going to be the depressing place. Like, these girls are older. They probably remember more. Like, these are going to be the ones who are just, really where it's heavier. And, maybe they're, I was in my 20s at the time. So I'm like, some of them are in early, like late high school, early college. I'm like, they're more almost my peers. Like, I don't know how to relate. And we walk up, and these 3 young women come out that were between their senior year of high school and first year of college. And they walk up and they say in perfect English, they introduce themselves, stick out their hands and say, hi, nice to meet you. Where are you from? And they start asking me questions about myself. I'm like, man, these are confident, articulate girls who one was studying to be an accountant. One wanted to be a teacher. And I just remember thinking, man, like this is beyond anything I imagined. And these girls were just unbelievable. And the ones that were getting ready to graduate high school had these incredible dreams and ambitions. And I remember thinking, like, I have to be a part of this. Like, how do I help girls like this? If they came from there and they're out there, like, these are girls who can change the world. I want to be a part of this story. And then that night I was on a plane back to Seattle. So you can imagine that 30-hour trip back from India, just kind of my head spinning, thinking, what did I just encounter and what do I do about it? So I came back to Seattle kind of overwhelmed, trying to figure out, what to do. And it took me some time to I started just sort of processing with some friends. And one of those friends was Rotarian Ben Wicks, who's actually on this webinar that you've heard his name now a couple times. And I had agreed that summer, one of my hobbies growing up in Monroe in the foothills of the Cascades from the time I was young was climbing mountains. And I had agreed to take Ben Wicks and a few other friends on their first trip up Mount Rainier. And that had been a bucket list item for a number of friends, and I had climbed it before. And so I agreed that summer that I would help kind of orchestrate a trip up Mount Rainier. And so Ben and a few others were going on the trip, and that we spent that whole summer kind of training and preparing, and we were climbing on the 4th of July. And so as we were preparing, we had our very last training climb out at a little place called Mailbox Peak, if you know, kind of just out by North Bend. We were doing our last training climb, and I remember we were driving out there. It was 14 days before the climb. And as I was driving out there, I thought, you know what? People do all kinds of things like marathons to raise money for cancer research. Why can't we turn this into a climb to fight slavery? So I pitched it to the guys and said, hey, let's create a thing called Climb for Captives. And let's try to raise $14,410, $1 for every vertical foot to fight human trafficking. And Ben and the other guys were like, sure, let's give it a try. So we launched this campaign, called it Climb for Captives, to fight slavery around the world. And we had no idea what it would become. What ended up happening was in 14 days, we exceeded the goal. And a bunch of other people said, well, when's the next Climb for Captives? When can we climb? We want to do a fundraiser to fight human trafficking. So then we had to organize another one. And then people started saying, hey, will you come and speak about human trafficking to our Rotary or to our church group or to our business? And so we started sharing more about human trafficking, and it just started snowballing. And the other challenge was that we had to find a way to give that money away. And I was trying to find different groups to partner with. And I started noticing a challenge that there were several groups we had partnered with that were American groups trying to recruit Americans to move to remote corners of the world to go fight slavery in those communities. And I remember talking to a large organization that had been doing a 5-year feasibility study to open their second safe house in another country. And they were trying to recruit Americans to learn the language, learn the culture, raise an American salary to then move to that country, figure out the best place to open a safe house, figure out how to do it, who to work with. But because I had lived in a few countries and had these connections, I said, well, I already know people in that country. And I bet you if I call them, they could tell me who's already on the ground in that country. And sure enough, I started finding these amazing entities that were already on the ground, giving their lives to fight human trafficking in their community. They knew the language, they knew the culture, they knew the corruption, they knew how it happened, why it happened, where it happened. And hiring them in country was way cheaper than uprooting an American family and paying their American salaries and relocating them. And so a group of us started dreaming about, well, what would it look like to either find or build an organization that instead of recruiting Americans to move around the world, if we could find the best local initiatives all over the world, if we could find them and vet them, and then if we could come alongside of them and provide training and resources and tools and funding and connection so that they're a part of a network, so that they're not fighting slavery alone, because human trafficking is this global issue that is the fastest growing criminal enterprise on the planet right now. Human trafficking is the fastest growing, and it's the second largest after the global drug trade. It's actually bigger than the international arms trade. And so here you have this massive issue that's perpetuated by organized crime, by cartels, by gangs, by mafias that work across borders. And yet the majority of the fight in response to that is these hyper-local people who are giving their lives to rescue and restore and serve and prevent in their little community. But they're often isolated, they're often alone, they're often undertrained, underfunded, under-resourced, underconnected. So we said, well, what would it look like to either find or build that organization? We spent about 2 years trying to find that organization and determined that it didn't exist. And so we had to build it. And so 8.5 years ago, Rescue Freedom was born with this idea of how do we build a global strategy, because human trafficking is a global issue. So how do we build a global strategy that can holistically fight slavery around the world to move the needle in the fight against slavery, and bridge the best of sort of international tools, resources, connections, relationships, training, knowledge, capacity, but merge that with the fact that the majority of the work out there is happening by these hyper-local entities who are on the ground, embedded in their community, heads down. They don't know what's happening 500 miles away, but they're an expert within their 50 square miles. And so how do we connect them together? And so Rescue Freedom was born, and we started identifying those local partners, coming alongside of them. One of our first hires was a full-time PhD trauma therapist that was one of the top specialists in the world on sexual trauma and sex trafficking, to say, how do we actually provide the trauma therapy resources? Because no one of these local partners can actually provide or have the budget or the salary to hire a PhD trauma therapist just for their one program. But if we can bring that in at scale and use that to train hundreds of employees all over the world who are working day in and day out, now suddenly everybody has access to one of the top PhD trauma therapists. And we can sort of the rising tide raises all the ships. And so 8.5 years later, we now work across the United States and in 20 countries around the world. So our staff is kind of scattered all over the place. We have about 150 programs across those 20 countries that we're running, from the prevention side of how do we get upstream and prevent the most vulnerable who are on the fast track into slavery? How do we prevent them from being exploited? To we have right now about 39 different safe houses, specifically residential programs for women, boys, girls, that offer vocational training, emotional care, trauma therapy, education, scholarships. So it really covers this whole spectrum. And then on the back end, it's how do we empower these women to have a future, to pursue their dreams, to have a new and bright future, as well as work with law enforcement to actually transition systems of justice so that we can see long-term cultural change. So it's grown pretty aggressively in the last 8.5 years. And so I want to just touch on the sort of unique time in history, because COVID-19 has really radically shifted our industry in an unprecedented way. And so there's a few trends to know. One of the things with human trafficking is, people often ask, like, how does somebody get trafficked? And a lot of times there's a misconception because of maybe some Hollywood movies that the majority of people are trafficked because there's these sinister, bad guys who drive around and look for an unattended, teenager or preteen, and they grab her off the sidewalk or out of her front yard when her parents aren't looking and throw her into the back of a bus and drive away. Now, that happens, but it doesn't happen that often. The typical story around the world on human trafficking is traffickers are going to prey on the most vulnerable. Right? It's, the sort of famous movie that popularized sort of mainstream trafficking was the movie Taken by Liam Neeson. If you've seen that, Liam Neeson is this former CIA assassin, and his daughter gets kidnapped. And then he hunts down and basically eliminates all the traffickers. Well, if you're a human trafficker, you're probably not going to risk kidnapping some girl that her dad might be this, the special forces guy, when you can target a kid that's extremely vulnerable, a kid that's in the foster system, or a kid that is in a really broken context with maybe a parent that's an addict, or a kid that is desperate. One of the common phrases we hear from law enforcement here in the US, kids end up trafficked because they're desperate for love and they're looking for love in all the wrong places. Maybe it's kids whose parents they might be in the picture, but maybe they're just absent from their lives. Maybe they're just workaholics and they don't invest in their kids. And that kid is just desperate for affirmation. And they go on the internet looking for somebody to tell them that they're beautiful, somebody to tell them that they matter. But it's people who are vulnerable to affection, vulnerable, or just vulnerable due to the economic or environmental. So they're refugees, they're foster kids, they're orphans. Traffickers are going to target those people. So when something like COVID happens, the vulnerable get more vulnerable, right? So those who are in situations of economic instability in this time, they're the most likely, or maybe those who are barely eking out a living around the world. When jobs were lost, they were the first ones to lose their jobs. So in the COVID context, the vulnerable are getting more vulnerable. Some other interesting trends that are happening is one of the things that's really interesting. So the majority of the world is actually quarantining and sheltering in place much more rigorously than in the United States. We have the Constitution and we have the First Amendment and we have all these freedoms that, that kind of keep a massive social crackdown in balance, right? Because Americans are like, well, wait a sec, okay, we'll shelter in place, but we got to have some movement. Where a lot of the countries we work in, there's several countries we work in where you have to designate one member of your family who's allowed to leave your property, and they can only leave your property one day a week, only on foot, only to go to a grocery store, a pharmacy, or a hospital, basically. And they'll likely be stopped by law enforcement along the way to inspect to make sure that they are that one designated family member, that they have not left the property any other time that week. So you think about the implications of that in most parts of the world. When these shelter-in-place orders hit, the majority of the world's brothels and red light districts and illicit massage parlors and hubs of exploitation were shut down overnight. Like literally tens of thousands of brothels were completely shut down overnight all over the world. And it's unbelievable. I mean, we've never seen anything like it. Now for us, we've been dreaming about the day where we could, what would it look like to shut down all the world's brothels, right? Well, it happened overnight because one, traffickers were quarantined at home. They couldn't get there. If they're the one member of their family, it's hard. If you get one day for a few hours that you can leave your house on foot, you know, you can't run to the brothel. But the other thing is there's no customers. There were no customers going into these red light areas in most places because the men were home on quarantine. In some places like Thailand, that would depend largely on sex tourism, those tourists that come from all over the world as sex tourists to Thailand, they're not traveling right now. And so we had this unbelievable phenomenon where the majority of the world's brothels instantly shut down and the traffickers were quarantined away. And you have tens of thousands of women and children that were essentially set free. But the challenge was they had nowhere to go. They had no way to make revenue. They had no way to pay the bills, nowhere to feed their children. So we just saw this massive skyrocketing of desperate need of food issues, for them. So for us with Rescue Freedom, we instantly started hearing from all our local partners all over the world, what do we do? We have an unprecedented opportunity. We can go into the red light areas and build relationship. The brothels are wide open. In many instances, the women are fleeing the brothels. Some are going back to villages if they can, but many of them have nowhere to go because they were trafficked by family. So in the last 5 weeks, we've launched 15 COVID emergency response programs in 13 countries. Everything from emergency shelters, feeding programs. We've repurposed some of the women's empowerment programs to make personal protective equipment and hand sanitizer and soap. We've launched an emergency helpline for women who are desperate for services who can call in saying, I'm fleeing a red light area, or I have an opportunity to leave. Is there anywhere for me to go? We filled up every single bed in our entire network within 4 days of that. It's just been unbelievable what's happening around the world as we have this incredible once in a lifetime opportunity to bring freedom to women and children, boys and girls fleeing these red light areas. So there's a silver lining amidst this pandemic. But of course the traffickers are watching this too, right? The traffickers, they can't afford to keep these women, but they're banking on the fact that as these quarantine orders start to relax, they're banking on the fact that most of these women and children will just come back to the red light areas begging for food, desperate for a way to survive, that they'll have no other option. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that there's options so they don't have to go back. And also tackling some of the things that have spiked in the midst of this. So one of the things we're seeing in the midst of this is a lot of online companies right now. One of the things that happens when people are home from work and when kids are home from school, you know, I heard a stat recently that when kids are home from school, pornography consumption goes up by about 7,000%. Because kids are home, they're unattended, they're watching stuff on their, you know, what a lot of people don't know is a lot of what they're consuming is actually human trafficking. And there's a lot of data that 1 out of 5 images online that people see actually, and they don't know, if they're consuming pornography, 1 out of 5 of those images is a victim of human trafficking that was forced into pornography. So kids are actually, and adults are becoming kind of complicit in this exploitation. And pornographers are trying to say to these women, hey, you want a way to provide for yourself? Here's a webcam. You can live stream exploitation to men in America and Europe and around the world who can't go out onto the streets right now. But they're looking to get their fix and they're going to their computer to do it. So there's this surge of internet exploitation of both children and of women. And we're watching online trends, trying to develop tools to confront this massive surge in online exploitation that's happening. And Virginia will share a little bit about this as well, but traffickers are also trying to use this opportunity to target vulnerable teens, right? Teens who are home now. And unfortunately for a lot of kids around the country and around the world, being home from school is not a good thing for every kid, right? A lot of kids come from homes where maybe school, and some of this may have been some of your stories. For many kids around the country, school is their safe place. School is the place where they feel like they belong, or they feel, and maybe they're in a home that's not a healthy environment for them, which increases their vulnerability, and they're on a computer all the time or on their smartphone all the time. And so they're more susceptible to the grooming process of traffickers reaching out and saying, hey, wow, you're beautiful. Has anyone ever told you that? You know, and they're starting to look for those teens who are home, who are scared, who are afraid, who feel like they're not loved, they don't belong, they have no community, they feel more isolated than ever before. So those are some of the trends that we're really watching for in this unique season. So as you can imagine, we've got our work cut out for us. It's a unique time right now. Obviously, economically, our country is hurting. I know many of you, if you own businesses, there's businesses are struggling. And so we're seeing our community of abolitionists. One of the things I love about this cause is people like Virginia who hear about it and they start to identify themselves as modern day abolitionists. What it took historically to move the needle on slavery was people from every sector of society saying, I'm going to be an abolitionist. And not saying I'm going to quit my job and go work for a nonprofit. It's saying, no. Like the British abolitionist movement, the famous William Wilberforce era that took slavery, when you think about what they accomplished in the late 1700s, early 1800s, when the majority of the world's economies were built on the backs of a legal slave trade. Like slavery was completely legal and the biggest businesses were built on the back of slavery. And so they said, we're gonna take down slavery. But what was interesting is there was all of these people that came around them that were leaders in their industries. So William Pitt, who was Wilberforce's best friend, was the prime minister of England at the time. And he said, okay, I'll be an abolitionist prime minister. And then this guy named Josiah Wedgwood, who was one of the leading industrialists, he had kind of pioneered the industrialization of modern Chinaware, like plates and cups. In fact, Wedgwood China is still around today. So if you have China in your pantry, there's probably about a 25% chance that it's a Wedgwood China, 250 years later. And Josiah Wedgwood said, I'm going to be a business owner abolitionist. And so you had these people who branded themselves abolitionists and said, we are going to be a part of fighting slavery. And what they did is they actually changed the course of history. They made slavery illegal, and then they built this abolitionist movement. Well, people ask how we can be so hopeful as an organization, because that's honestly, we say it's written on the walls at our office that it is not the injustice that drives us, it's the magnitude of hope. And people hear like, man, there's more slaves in the world today than any other time in history. Isn't that crazy? More slaves right now than any other time in history. And yet we have hope. Well, part of the reason we have hope is because for the first time in history, slavery is now illegal in every single country of the world. There's national laws, there's UN laws that the whole world has said, we're not okay with slavery. So we look at it and say, well, if William Wilberforce and his crew could take down slavery as they knew it in an era when not only was it completely legal, completely taken for granted, but everybody was lining their pockets. Now, it's a very, very, very small percentage of humanity that perpetuates slavery. The overwhelming majority of us have agreed slavery is not okay. And so as this global community rises together to say, we are abolitionists, we will end slavery in our lifetimes, we absolutely believe that we can break the back of this historic institution, that we can end sexual exploitation and human trafficking as we know it in our lifetimes. And so I'm just so thrilled to see groups. I mean, Rotary Rotary International has jumped into this issue in a big way. And honestly, I think they're just getting warmed up. I think we're going to see just some incredible momentum as abolitionists from around the world link arms to say, together we can end slavery. So I'm just so grateful for the opportunity to share with you. Would love to answer any questions. Would love to, if especially in this COVID time, where if you're trying to figure out what to do with your local Rotary and you want to have a member of our team share via Zoom with your local Rotary, we'd be happy to do that. Would love to connect and be a resource to you. So I'll put our contact information in the chat, but it's pretty simple. It's just contact@rescuefreedom.org. But please check us out online to learn more. We're always sending out updates, exciting news, trends about what's happening in the fight against human trafficking. I'm blasting stuff around. We'll see what this new kind of post-pandemic world is going to look like. Normally, I'm traveling all over the world and sending out updates from the UN and from the Vatican and from communities around the world that are leaning in with us to fight human trafficking. So would love to have you along with us for the journey. Visit us at rescuefreedom.org. You can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We're wherever you are, we're probably there. So find us there. And again, feel free to reach out at contact@rescuefreedom.org to get more connected, to get engaged, or if coming to your Rotary would be something that would be helpful for you and your community. So thanks for having me, sharing your Memorial Day weekend with me. I'm grateful to be here.
Jeremy, wow. Thank you. I loved hearing that whole story again. And And you're right, as we don't have to quit our day jobs to move the needle on this. And I just think about how uniquely positioned Rotarians are to make a difference on this. We are leaders at the grassroots level. We care about the world. We have connections all over the world. And I just feel so emboldened by listening to you. And I am so excited to plug into your good work and bring as many Rotarians along with me as possible. So as promised, I wanted to share some tips on how.
Do you want me to, I'm seeing a question here. Do you want me to do a quick, you want to do that now or you want to do that after?
I think we'll do the questions at the end.
Okay, great.
Yeah. So let's see here. So protecting children from online predators. The internet, for all of its benefits, also gives criminals and predators an easy way to reach out to young people. The FBI most often sees crimes against children begin when an adult forges a relationship with a young victim online and then later arranges to meet and abuse the child, or coerces a child into producing sexually explicit images or videos through manipulation, gifts, or threats. This is a serious crime called sextortion. So the emphasis here is the most important advice for parents is to have open and ongoing conversations about safe and appropriate online behavior. Here are some specific tips from the FBI on how to keep your children safe online. Number one, educate yourself about the websites, software, games, apps that your children use. Check their social media and gaming profiles and posts. Have conversations about what's appropriate to say or share. Explain to your kids that once images or comments are posted online, they can be shared with anyone and they never truly disappear. Make sure your kids use privacy settings to restrict access to their online profiles. Tell your children to be extremely wary when communicating with anyone online that they do not know in real life. Encourage kids to use appropriate screen names and to create strong passwords. Make it a rule with your kids that they do not arrange to meet up with anyone they meet online without your knowledge and supervision. Stress to your children that making any kind of threat online, even if they think it's a joke, it is a crime. And lastly, report any inappropriate contact between an adult and your child to law enforcement immediately. Also notify the site where they were using as well. So right now, our kids are online more than ever. They have schooling online, social media, video games, and the sad truth is anywhere where our children are, there are predators and traffickers. And so I just wanted to share these tips with you about how to protect your children. So with that, I want to share some key takeaways before we open it up to questions. Number one, I hope that you will join my Facebook group. My Facebook group can be found, look up End Trafficking Now with Seattle for Rotary. Right now I have 167 members, most of them Rotarians, many in Seattle, but some all over the world, and some close family and friends. This is the main channel that I use to promote service projects that I'm joining, articles that I am finding, and I encourage you to share things that you're finding as well. There is a Rotary Action Group Against Slavery, RAGAS, And membership there is very inexpensive. I think a lifetime membership is $50, and you get a really inspiring quarterly newsletter about all of the amazing projects all over the world by Rotarians. At the Rotary International Convention, I always attend. There's a board of directors meeting that I always attend, and just a phenomenal group of Rotarians there. Invite Rescue Freedom to speak at your Rotary Club. And again, that contact information is contact@rescuefreedom.org. You heard it from Jeremy Valorand himself that they will be excited to speak at your Rotary Club. Maybe we could find some more people to join me on a citizen diplomacy trip. I know just last week, Kirkland Rotary had Rescue Freedom speak for them. Once I get organized around the citizen diplomacy trip, I'll be sharing that through my Facebook group, or you can reach out to me individually. The tips that I shared regarding how to protect your children from online predators is off of the FBI website, so just www.fbi.gov. Scams and safety, protecting your kids. There's a lot of very practical, good advice there. And then I want to share the National Trafficking Hotline. So if you suspect someone may be suffering from trafficking, you can report a tip about a potential case, and it will be referred to the local authorities for and service providers for follow-up. You can get service referrals for victims of trafficking, and you can request more training. So the National Trafficking Hotline is 1-888-37-37-888. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions. You can ask questions of me, of Jeremy, and we will respond. Thank you.
And as a reminder, the Q&A box is at the bottom of your control panel. You can also use the raise hand function, and we can allow you to answer your question live. And definitely encourage you to take a picture or screenshot of these takeaways. So some great resources on the screen. But as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and is accessible on our YouTube Festival of Training site. The link was posted in the chat window. But I think the first question from Ben Wicks was, I think this is to Jeremy, you talked mostly about global. How is this issue in Seattle?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, yeah, it's important to know, yes, it is in fact an issue here in Seattle. And we have been working here in Seattle and then in other parts of the country. So a couple of things that you would have disproportionately here in Seattle. One of the areas that we are, or one of the elements of exploitation we are known for, are illicit massage parlors. And so I'm sure many of you have probably, if you've heard about this issue, you probably have suspect places you've driven by before where you're like, why is that massage parlor completely blacked out, and why are they open until 1 in the morning? And why does it seem like there's never any cars in the front and all the people are going in through the back? That we are one of the hubs in the United States for illicit massage parlors. So that's one of the ways that trafficking happens here in Seattle. There's some obviously great local organizations here that work exclusively in Seattle as well. COVID-19 is definitely affecting Seattle. A couple trends that we're seeing. Again, with a lot of the jobs that are lost right now in this climate, restaurant jobs, more of the hourly jobs, that a lot of recent survivors who have escaped from trafficking, a lot of times that's where they start in their transition out of the life. Is they start with those entry-level jobs, because many of them, if they were trafficked, in high school, they're in the process of finishing their GED. Obviously, it's hard to have a work history. Like, you're not exactly putting, when people want like reference checks and like, what were your last 2 jobs? And it's like, wait, you're 24 years old and you don't have any employment history since you were 16. Trafficking is a massive resume gap. And so a lot of them, employment can be a difficult thing. And thankfully there's more and more businesses in Seattle that are sort of willing to create employment pathways for sort of non-conventional backgrounds or people that don't have conventional resumes, but we're hearing from many of them that the survivors were the first that are hit. And so for many of them, if they've been out of the life for 2 years, but they have no other means, again, of paying their bills, if they lost their job. And so we know that survivors have been extremely affected here in Seattle and around the country by COVID. And so we're trying to find ways, again, here and all over the United States, to provide stability and job resources for survivors. And many of our local partners are working on that issue. But trafficking, unfortunately, is an issue here. It is the majority of trafficking that happens in the United States. Is people often think of it as, and I've heard people ask the question or phrase the question of, well, Seattle's a port city, so do we have a lot of trafficking, into the ports, and we're a border city with Canada? Actually, the majority of trafficking in the United States is women and girls and boys from within the United States. Again, with traffickers kind of pre 9/11, if you remember back in the day before 9/11, when you could go up to Vancouver and cross the border with like a library card or like your AAA membership, it used to be way easier to cross borders. After 9/11, traffickers, that's a huge risk for traffickers. It doesn't mean they don't do it. They do traffic across borders, but usually it's pretty sophisticated. They have to have fake visas and passports. And so again, if they can drive down to South Center Mall and find a girl who's there, every day skipping the last period of class, and they can walk up to that 14, 15, 16-year-old and say, wow, you're beautiful. Like, don't your parents care that you're here every day? Like the stories are very similar of how they often recruit, at least in sort of pre-COVID times when they're able to go to the mall, where they can say to a girl like that, hey, don't your parents care that you're here? Shouldn't you be in school? And then they just listen for the girl to say something like, my parents don't care. Or like, my mom, she doesn't care where I am. She never knows. Like, and it's like, ding, ding, ding. Okay. Like no parental engagement, like this person, like the cues for vulnerability and loneliness. And they can see how she responds. Like, wow, you look good. Did anybody tell you look good today? And can I buy you dinner? And like the cultivation track. So for by and large, traffickers are going to default to exploiting locally, to finding their victims locally, and or within the United States. So that's part of how it plays out here in Seattle as well, is people targeting locally, playing out locally. The exception to that typically is the illicit massage parlors, which mostly are most of those. The trafficking is taking place from 3 countries in Asia specifically, to supply the majority of the United States illicit massage parlors.
Thank you, Jeremy. Any other questions? Feel free to use the raise hand function, and we can allow you to speak, or use the Q&A, or the chat box is fine too. I actually did have a question, Jeremy. Because it's such an international problem, how do you maintain those communications channels, especially when you're talking about going between countries? And is it like very centralized, or do you just have to rely on the organizations kind of on the ground in each country?
So it's a little bit of everything. So we have what we call regional coordinators. So it's kind of scattered around the world. We have Rescue Freedom staff members in country, or in region. So we have, someone in Latin America. We have someone in Africa. We have team members kind of scattered around who their job is to really be hands-on, to kind of keep the pulse on everything that's going on in their region, policy-wise, on whether that's COVID-19 policies and how quick they're evolving. But then also, so part of what we do is we also facilitate kind of inter-network communication. So an example is, we have a local partner in Colombia that was launching a new program that our partner in Bolivia had been doing for 10 years. And so we said, okay, great. Well, what we'll do is we'll kind of scholarship your leadership team to fly to Bolivia and spend a week getting mentored on how they run their programs. There's some cultural similarities, or certainly more cultural similarities between Colombia and Bolivia than there might be between Seattle and Bogota or whatever. And so, trying to build and facilitate the network of communications, inter-network, as well as from kind of central out into the community. But a lot of it is, having team members that are checking in, especially in this climate. We're checking in, every week with every local partner around the world, getting updates and reports, and using kind of every manner of communication, whether that's obviously, cell phones, internet, and having to adapt that, because some have had connectivity issues as there's been challenges in their countries. And so kind of hitting all channels. But it's been really inspiring to see. I think one of the things I think for me that has been so impactful is you can imagine if you're doing this work day in and day out, like most of the people that are doing it on the front lines, they're getting death threats from the mafias in their community. I mean, they're giving everything. And some of them, when we find them, I mean, I'll never forget going to one of the homes, this couple that had literally given everything. I mean, they had mortgaged their house. They didn't know how they were going to pay for it. They had 44 teenage girls living in 1,800 square feet, and they didn't have a single piece of furniture. And I remember going in, and these girls had come out of a brothel, and they were like so just joyful. And they were like, we've got community. We have people that are caring for us. We have food. And I was asking, like, I couldn't believe it. I was like, how are you guys paying for this? And they're like, barely. They said, we have a weekly prayer meeting just to pray that we have enough food for the next week. And they're like, last month we didn't have enough food. And we finally told the girls, like, we don't know if we're going to be able to have food tomorrow. And they said, if anybody wants to come to our prayer meeting, we don't know what else to do, but pray that somehow God would bring food. They said the next day they had like 50 pounds of rice, bags of rice on the door, and they don't know where they came from. But it just shows people are just giving everything. And so when Rescue Freedom comes into the picture and not only brings that funding and some of that stability, but brings community and says, hey, there's actually somebody in the next state over or in the next region over that's doing similar work. We're going to connect you, and you guys can, you can have a peer mentor. Then the biggest thing that I hear, and it's usually with tears streaming down their face, is it feels so good not to be alone. And our belief is, like, if you're going to give your life to help those escaping slavery, we don't want you to do it alone. At least, if nothing else, you shouldn't have to do it alone. That we can build this army of abolitionists and be in it together. And so building that community, building that connection and that communication has been really critical.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question for Virginia, and then I'm gonna get to Howard with his hand raised. But Benai had a question that kind of piggybacks off what you just answered, Jeremy. So in working with organizations outside of Rescue Freedom, how do you collaborate, or should they email and try and start that conversation? What's the best way to start?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, so with our contact email, certainly share that. So I see somebody asking about like a group in Nepal. So we do work in Nepal. So part of it is, there's a lot of amazing organizations out there. Our model is such that we're probably one of the more collaborative anti-trafficking organizations you'll find out there, because our entire model is built on identifying the best local partners and accelerating them at scale. So by default, we're proactively, our job is to collaborate and to accelerate the global fight. So we are always looking for partners. Right now, I'll tell you, so we have right now about 27 local partners in 20 countries. We are actively vetting 32 additional organizations. But when we come alongside an organization, it's not just, we made a one-time grant. Like when we come in, it's all hands on deck. We are coaching them. We're coaching their programs. We're coaching their infrastructure. We're coaching their staff. 4 of our 27 local partners are going through a founder transition. So we're working with their leadership teams. Because if you know, corporate or nonprofit, every sector, the founder transition statistics of how many organizations survive founder transitions are dismal. So working with them to ensure continuity of care and services through founder transitions. And so we do take, we always are collecting information, but a lot of times the way that our model works is most of the time we're proactively looking for, okay, we're working in this region. We have a partner that specializes in this, this, and this. And in order to have a holistic strategy to move the needle on slavery in that region, we need to add a partner that does this. So if we have a really good safe house, a really good prevention program, but there's nobody working with law enforcement to prosecute traffickers, we're going to default to finding a local partner that specializes in adding that component so that we have a holistic fight versus just like adding more safe houses, for instance. That if we're in a region where we've got, we don't want to have 10 safe houses, but nobody that's helping do empowerment programs. Because if you get all these women out, but there's no jobs and no future for them, there's not a lot of hope. Or if you're getting a bunch of women out, but there's nobody doing prevention, and so there's this unlimited pipeline of vulnerable girls getting re-trafficked. So for us, it's kind of this complex algorithm of saying, okay, what needs to happen in the region? What are the dominoes that need to get lined up and then fall to tip the scale on slavery? And how do we align the local partners in a holistic way to actually fight slavery? So that's part of the reason why we do have 30 organizations in the pipeline that we're sort of vetting and building that puzzle piece to actually map out a holistic strategy to fight slavery.
Wow, Jeremy. I'm learning so much about you and Rescue Freedom right now. Wow. I had no idea it was that integrated. I'm so excited to partner with you. I can barely stand it and enroll Rotarians all around the world in this.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks,
and
Virginia.
Virginia, kind of along the same lines, we had a question on talking just a little bit more about what Rotary is doing on this issue. So kind of that.
Yeah, so we've got the Rotary Action Group Against Slavery. Actually, there's a Rotary Club starting in Minneapolis. It's going to be chartered January 18th. It is the Rotary Club to End Human Trafficking. And they already have members from all over the world, California to Thailand. I am definitely going to be attending this Rotary Club to End Human Trafficking as a guest and look for ways to collaborate with them. In terms of locally in Seattle, we had a very successful grant, one of many, but one that I'll mention here, where we got training to doctors and nurses how to notice if the person that they're treating in their emergency room may be suffering from trafficking. We know from talking to survivors, 85% of them access healthcare systems while being trafficked, often to emergency medical services, because they're leading a very rough life. They suffer from getting beat up, drug overdoses, suicide attempts. And historically, what has happened is the emergency room treats the emergent problem. They pump their stomach or stitch them up or whatever, and then send them right back out the door, usually hand in hand with their trafficker. And so the intervention idea is, what if we could train doctors and nurses to notice the signs of trafficking, notice branding tattoos, and that hypervigilant, usually older male who presents as a love interest or a family member, but like doesn't know basic details about the patient. These are telltale signs. And then when you see that, what do you do? How do you respond in a trauma-informed and HIPAA-compliant way? And so this was a grant with Seattle Against Slavery and Stolen Youth. And through this program, over 1,000 doctors and nurses in King County and Pierce County have received this training. And if you would like to learn more about that, please watch the video from the Festival of Training that aired Thursday night, called the Healthcare Alliance.
Awesome. Thank you, Virginia. I'm going to let Howard ask his question. In the meantime, Jeremy, I think there was a follow-up from Benaya, so it sounds like maybe it's just a matter of who to contact or to make that connection. So.
Yeah, the best starting point is that contact at Rescue Freedom. So if you have leads, or it sounds like you might be based in Nepal, would love send us an email, and would love to learn more about what you're doing there. And we're I don't know what our travel schedule is going to look like in this post-pandemic world. Normally, our team would be in Nepal with some regularity, and so would love to connect more with Rotary Nepal as well. If you drop us an email at contact@Rescue Freedom and reach out and let us know where you are, we would definitely love to connect.
All right, Howard, you're on.
Hi there. Jeremy, I have to tell you, I was moved by your talk, moved to tears, actually, by your talk. I work in the hotel industry and manage housekeepers, and we've recently actually met somebody from BEST, which is Businesses Ending Sex Trafficking, which I was involved in the beginning of that organization many years ago. Oh, and after I met them at a Rotary party last summer, I actually had him come out and retrain my staff. And now after this talk today, I'm going to have them come back again and retrain them again, because you can't get trained enough.
Yeah, absolutely.
During this pandemic, I've had a very light staff at the hotel, so I've worked at the desk a little bit, and I even see things like you just mentioned that opens your eyes and goes, what in God's name?
Yeah.
Virginia, I actually just signed up for your Facebook page.
Oh, I love it.
Thank you, Howard.
I'm waiting to be approved. And
I will admit you right now.
I'm curious about the Rotary Club to end human trafficking. Kathy mentioned it to me the other day. She was going to send me the invite. Since we already belong to another club, can we be an honorary member of that club? Since we're already a member of a club?
So what they said to me was, because I was inclined to be a member of two clubs, right? Like, I'm ready to sign up. And they said, we're not encouraging that. Actually, we need Rotarians as part of their own club, so we have people to collaborate with. But basically, she said, attend all the meetings and you are welcome. They're out of Rotary District 5950. The district governor there is Thomas Gump. And the inaugural meeting is June 18th. The charter president will be a guest presenter at a Rotary Club in Vancouver, BC next Thursday at noon. And if you are interested, Howard, I would love to send you the Zoom link to that meeting, and we can hear together from that charter club, that charter president, about the plans.
Well, that's great. I was mentioning to Kathy the other day that I'm going to contact a bunch of my fellow hoteliers and try to get some of those members, those people, to join that club because sex trafficking is pervasive everywhere. Unfortunately, especially hotels.
Yeah.
So the more we can educate hoteliers and hotel managers and housekeeping managers, those are the ones right in the battlefield.
Well, and yes, and I would add to that, I mean, that's a way business people can help be abolitionists, but also as a business manager, it reduces your risk. It is a business liability to let that go on in your hotel and turn a blind eye. It is a real business risk in addition to just being the right thing to do.
And we have been known to actually evict and not allow them to return people that have crossed the line in some areas, and it's been a thing. And I know that Kathy Gibson is very dedicated to this cause, and I pledge that when I'm district governor, I will be as dedicated as Kathy and continue that.
Thank you, Howard.
Yeah, thanks for what you're doing. I'm a fan of BEST. I've been connected with them since Dr. Mar Bretman founded it at the beginning. So love what they're doing, and Mar is someone I respect deeply in this fight. So
yeah, thank you. Good luck. We'll be in touch.
All right.
Awesome. Thank you all so much. And let me check if there's any final questions. It doesn't look like it, but again, this session is recorded and it will be posted on that YouTube link soon. And just as a quick reminder, for everyone who's loving this festival of training, this awesome month that we've had so far and will continue to have, there's 2 more bonus sessions that will be available on June 4th. So ever wish you could change something about Rotary, here's how. And then optimizing online Rotary meetings session, which couldn't be more important. So I think we've all kind of managed that shift online, still being productive, and we see an example of how we can have a great meeting, bringing Jeremy in potentially to speak at a club meeting. So if anyone wants more information, you should be seeing that coming out shortly from your club leaders. But if there's nothing else, then thank you so much. Any final words, Jeremy or Virginia, before we shut it down?
No, thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to being in touch with anyone who wants to reach out. So.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate all the support through Rotary on this topic, and I look forward to